Every Sunday, at exactly 7 o'clock, George Harrison sat in the same chair, not because it was comfortable, but because, from that chair, he could see the old telephone, the beige telephone, rested quietly on a small wooden table. Its cord had faded with age. Its buttons had become smooth after decades of faithful use. The phone almost never rang anymore. In today's world, everyone carried a cell phone, but George never disconnected. The old landline. People often asked, why keep paying for a phone nobody calls? George would smile, then quietly answer, because once, someone always did. George was 76 years old. He had lived in the same little house for 48 years. Every room held a memory. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon whenever he baked. The living room still displayed the wedding photograph taken 53 years earlier. His wife, Margaret, smiled forever. From that picture, she had been gone 8 years. Their daughter, Emily, had called every Sunday evening without fail. Dad, how was your week? What did you plant? In the garden? Did you remember to take your medicine? Sometimes they talked for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. The conversations were never extraordinary, but they became the heartbeat of George's week. Then, one rainy evening, 12 years ago, everything changed. A highway accident, a phone call from a state trooper, Assilance, that never truly left. After Emily was gone, the Sunday calls stopped forever. Neighbors suggested removing the old phone. You don't need it anymore. George only smiled. No, I still need what it reminds me of. So every Sunday, he made himself a simple dinner. He poured 1 cup of tea. He sat in the same chair, and he looked at the silent telephone. He wasn't expecting it to ring. Not anymore. He simply wanted to remember the sound that had once made the whole house feel alive. Across the street, a moving truck pulled into the driveway of the old Wilson house. Boxes, furniture, children's bicycles filled the front yard. George watched quietly from his window. A young woman stepped out of the truck. She looked tired, but determined. Beside her was a little girl, perhaps 8 years old. She held tightly to a worn teddy bear. The child looked toward George's house. She noticed the elderly man sitting alone by the window. She lifted her hand and gave him a shy little wave. George paused. For a moment, he wasn't sure if she meant him. Then, very slowly, he smiled and waved back. It was the first smile he had shared with anyone in several days. Inside the quiet house, the old telephone remained silent. But somewhere, without George knowing, life had already begun, preparing its next Sunday. Monday morning arrived quietly. George followed the same routine he had kept for years. He woke at 6 o'clock, made oatmeal, watered Margaret's roses, fed the birds, then sat on the front porch with a warm cup of coffee. The neighborhood was slowly waking up. Children waited for the school bus, Dostparke, behind wooden fences. Someone across the street played old country music. George liked listening to life, even when he wasn't part of it. Across the road, the family who had moved in the day before was still unpacking. Boxes covered the porch. Furniture filled the garage. The little girl George had seen the previous evening was carefully placing flower pots along the front steps. Every few minutes, she stopped to catch her breath. The pots were much too heavy for someone. George watched for a while, then quietly walked across the street. Need a little help? He asked. The little girl looked up, a little surprised. My mom says I shouldn't lift the big ones. George smiled. I think your mom is a smart woman. Together, they carried the last few flower pots on the beyond. Just as they finished, the young woman came outside. Oh goodness, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize she asked you to help. George shook his head. She didn't. I volunteered. The woman smiled. I'm Rachel, and this is my daughter, Sophie. Sophie stepped forward, still holding her teddy bear. His name is Mr. Buttons, she explained proudly. George chuckled. Nice to meet both of you. Rachel looked toward George's house. You live alone? George nodded gently. My wife passed away a long time ago. Rachel's smile softened. I'm sorry, George answered with the calm voice that only time can teach. You never stop missing someone. You simply learn to carry the missing. Rachel remained quiet, as though she understood more than she wanted to say. A moving box near the porch slipped open. Photographs scattered across the sidewalk. George bent down to help gather them. One picture caught his attention. Rachel, Sophie, and an older man smiling together at a fishing lake. Your father? George asked. Rachel nodded. He passed away last spring. Sophie still talks to his picture every night. George looked at Sophie. The little girl was quietly holding the photograph as if she didn't want to let it go. George smiled gently. My daughter used to do the same thing. Pictures help us remember. They remind us that love doesn't disappear. Sophie looked up. My grandpa liked pancakes. George laughed softly. So did my Emily. The little girl thought for a moment, then asked with complete innocence, do you still miss her? George looked toward his house, toward the window, where the old telephone still rested. Every single day, he whispered, but some days, the missing feels a little lighter when someone comes by to say hello. Before leaving, Rachel smiled. We're making pancakes next Sunday morning. If you'd like, you could join us. George hesitated. It had been many years since anyone had invited him to breakfast. He smiled warmly. I'd like that. As he walked back across the street, the quiet house didn't seem quite as lonely. Inside, the old telephone still hadn't rung. But for the first time in a very long while, George realized perhaps life didn't always return happiness with a phone call. Sometimes it arrived as a little girl holding a worn teddy bear and smiling from across the street. Sunday arrived quietly. The morning sunlight filtered gently through George's kitchen window. He mixed flour, milk, eggs, just enough to make pancakes. Then he stopped, looked at the bowl, and smiled sadly. For more than 50 years, he had never cooked breakfast for only one person. Margaret always made the pancakes. Emily always stole the first one before it reached the table. George laughed softly at the memory. Some habits never leave, even after the people do. At 9 o'clock, he walked across the street, carrying a small glass jar filled with homemade strawberry jam. Rachel opened the front door. You actually came, she said, with a warm smile. George chuckled. I almost didn't. It's been a long time since anyone invited me to breakfast. Inside, the house still smelled of fresh paint, but another smell was beginning to replace it. Warm pancakes, butter, maple syrup, fresh coffee. It smelled like home. Sophie came running into the kitchen. Mr. George, I saved the biggest pancake for you. George laughed. I think that's the nicest thing anyone has said to me this week. Breakfast was simple. No fancy dishes, no expensive food, just laughter, stories, and warm coffee. Rachel smiled. My father used to tell the same jokes every Sunday. George nodded. My wife laughed at the same joke for 40 years. Sophie frowned. Even if it wasn't funny, George smiled. Sometimes you laugh because you love the person, not the joke. Everyone laughed, even Sophie. After breakfast, George thanked them, then slowly walked home. His little house felt different, not bigger, not brighter, just less empty. That evening, as always, he made a cup of tea, sat in his old chair, and looked at the telephone. 7 o'clock. Exactly. He smiled. This was always the time. Emily called. The house was perfectly quiet. Then, without warning, the telephone rang. George froze. He stared at the phone. Certain. He had imagined it. It rang again. His hands began to tremble. Slowly, he reached for the receiver. Hello, he whispered. For a second, there was only silence. Then, a gentle voice. Hey, Mr. George. It was Rachel. George smiled. Oh, you scared an old man. Rachel laughed softly. I'm sorry. Sophie wanted to know if you got home. All right. George looked toward the empty chair across the room. No one has called to check on me in a very long time. Rachel became quiet. I hope you don't mind. George shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. No, I think I've been waiting for this call longer than I realized. Rachel smiled. Then, if it's okay, we'll call every Sunday. George closed his eyes. For 12 years, Sunday evenings had been filled with silence. Now, there was once again a friendly voice waiting at the other end of the line. After the call ended, George gently placed the receiver back on its cradle. He looked at Margaret's photograph, then whispered with a quiet smile, I know it wasn't Emily, but thank you for reminding me that an old heart can still hear good news. On a Sunday, outside, the porch light glowed softly against the evening sky, and inside, for the first time in many years, the old telephone no longer felt like a reminder of what George had lost. It had become a promise that next Sunday, someone would call again. The Sundays began to pass, one after another, just as they always had. But now, there was something George looked forward to every Sunday. At exactly 7 o'clock, the old telephone would ring. Sometimes Rachel called. Sometimes Sophie insisted on dialing the number herself. Mr. George, she would shout, I got an A on my spelling test. Or, my sunflower finally bloomed. George celebrated every little victory as though it belonged to his own family. The conversations were never long, 10 minutes, sometimes 15. But after hanging up, George no longer sat alone in silence. One rainy afternoon, Rachel stopped by with a basket of blueberry muffins. She knocked twice, no answer. She became worried, then noticed the front door was slightly open. George, she called softly. I'm in here, came a familiar voice. She found him in the living room, sitting beside the old telephone, not talking, not reading, simply looking at it. Rachel smiled. Waiting for Sunday already? George chuckled a little. Then he reached into a small drawer beside the telephone. He carefully pulled out a folded notebook. Its cover was worn, the corners soft from years of being touched. Rachel noticed. Every page contained names, dozens of them. Some had check marks, others small handwritten notes. She looked at George. "What is this?" George smiled quietly. "My Sunday list." Rachel frowned. "I don't understand." George slowly turned the pages. There was Mr. Collins. He lost his wife 20 years ago. He hated Sunday evenings. So I called him. Another page. Mrs. Hernandez. Her children lived in California. She didn't like bothering them. So I called her. Another page. Frank, a veteran. He always said the weekends were the hardest. So I called him too. Rachel stared at the notebook. There are so many names. George nodded. For almost 30 years, every Sunday, I called someone who might be eating dinner alone. Rachel whispered, "You never told anyone?" George smiled. "It wasn't something I wanted credit for. I just knew what loneliness sounded like. And sometimes it sounds exactly like a phone that never rings." Rachel felt her eyes fill with tears. She had believed George was only waiting for someone to call him. She never imagined that for decades he had been the one making sure others never felt forgotten. George gently closed the notebook. After Emily passed away, I stopped calling. I couldn't find the strength. The list stayed right here, he said, touching the little drawer. I always thought one day I'd begin again. Rachel looked at the notebook, then at George. "What if you didn't have to do it alone?" George smiled. "What do you mean?" Rachel answered without hesitation. "Next Sunday, we'll make 2 phone calls. You choose the first name. I'll dial." George looked at the old notebook. His fingers rested on its cover. For the first time in 12 years, the list no longer looked like a memory. It looked like a beginning. Outside, the rain slowly stopped. A rainbow appeared above Maple Street. Inside, beside the old telephone, 2 generations quietly decided that no one should have to wait for kindness to find them. Sometimes, kindness simply needed someone willing to make the first call. Sunday arrived once again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across George's living room. The old telephone waited quietly on its little wooden table. Beside it lay the notebook. The notebook George hadn't opened for 12 years. Rachel poured 2 cups of hot tea. Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug, holding Mr. Buttons in her lap. George gently opened the first page. His fingers paused over a familiar name, Walter Jenkins, 83. George smiled softly. Walter and I worked together at the hardware store. He lost his wife a few years before Margaret. We promised we'd call each Sunday. George looked down. Then, after Emily died, I stopped calling. I never knew if Walter thought I forgot him. Rachel reached for the receiver. "Let's find out." George slowly dialed the number. Each click echoed through the quiet room. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. George whispered. "Maybe." He moved. Just then, a tired voice answered. "Hello?" George froze. "Walter?" There was complete silence. Then, the old man spoke again, his voice shaking. "George, I thought you were gone." George smiled sadly. "No, I just got lost." For a while, Walter laughed, then quietly cried. At the same time, "You old fool," he said warmly. I waited. Every Sunday. For months. Then I figured. Life had simply darkness in different directions. George closed his eyes. "I'm sorry. I should have called." Walter answered, without hesitation. "You just did." For nearly 30 minutes, the two old friends talked about their aching knees, the tomatoes that never grew quite right anymore, the songs they still remembered, the wives they still missed. Every single day, Rachel quietly wiped away a tear. Sophie whispered, "They sound happy." Rachel smiled. "They are." When the call finally ended, Walter said, "George, same time. Next Sunday?" George laughed, a deep, warm laugh, one Rachel had never heard before. "You can count on it." After hanging up, George sat silently. His hand still rested on the receiver. "I didn't realize," he whispered, "how much I missed my old friend." Rachel gently opened the notebook. There are 27 more names. George looked at the pages, then smiled. "I don't think we'll finish the list very quickly." Sophie suddenly raised her hand. "I have an idea." George laughed. "What is it?" The little girl grinned. "What if every Sunday after dinner we call one person from the book?" George looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at George. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The answer was already in their smiles. That evening, at exactly 7 o'clock, the telephone rang. George answered. "Hello." It was Walter. "I forgot to tell you something." George laughed. "What?" Walter replied. "Thank you for remembering. I'm still here." George looked at the notebook, then at Sophie, then toward Margaret's photograph. Some people believe a ringing telephone is only a sound. George knew better. Sometimes it is hope traveling through a wire, and sometimes the smallest call can remind someone that even after years of silence, their name still lives in another person's heart. Autumn settled gently over the neighborhood. The maple leaves turned golden, then crimson, then slowly fell to the ground. Every Sunday, after dinner, George, Rachel, and Sophie gathered around the old telephone. The notebook lay open on the little table. One name every week, one phone call, one lonely heart, a little less lonely. Some conversations lasted 5 minutes, others an entire hour. Sometimes people laughed, sometimes they cried, but no one ever said, "I wish you hadn't called." One Sunday afternoon, George noticed something unusual. The notebook had only 3 names left. He gently ran his fingers across the pages. "So many old friends," he whispered. "So many beautiful voices." Rachel smiled. "And thanks to you, they're talking to each other again." George looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Rachel opened a small folder. Inside were handwritten notes, Christmas cards, birthday invitations, photographs. Vita started having coffee with Frank, Mrs. Hernandez, and Helen now have lunch every Wednesday. The Johnson twins visit Mr. Collins every month. George looked from one photograph to another. They didn't know each other. Rachel nodded. "They do now. Because you called." George sat quietly. He had believed he was only making phone calls. He never realized he had been building a community. Just then, the telephone rang. George smiled. "It isn't 7 o'clock yet." Rachel laughed. "Maybe someone forgot what time it is." George answered. "Hello?" There was silence. Then, a young man's voice. "Is this Mr. George Harrison? Yes, my name is Daniel. You don't know me, but you knew my grandmother. George frowned. Who was? Your grandmother? The young man answered quietly. Mrs. Hernandez. George smiled. Of course, I remember Maria. Daniel took a deep breath. My grandmother passed away last month. George lowered his head. I'm so very sorry. Daniel continued. Before she died, she asked me to find you. George's hands began to tremble. She told me that every Sunday, when everyone else forgot, you remembered. Daniel paused, trying not to cry. She said, your phone call made her feel like someone still expected her to be here. George closed his eyes for a long moment. He couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, I was only calling a friend. Daniel answered, no, you were, reminding her that she still mattered. After the call ended, the room remained silent. Sophie quietly walked over and slipped her little hand into George's. Mr. George, she whispered, I think Grandma Margaret and Emily would be very proud of you. George smiled. Tears rolled gently down his cheeks. For years, he believed the old telephone connected him to memories. Now, he understood. It connected people, not through the wires, but through kindness. Outside, the evening breeze carried the last autumn leaves across Maple Street. Inside, the old telephone waited patiently for next Sunday because somewhere, someone still needed to hear a familiar voice say just 4 simple words. How have you been? And sometimes, those 4 words were enough to make an entire week feel a little less lonely. Vinta arrived quietly. The mornings became colder. The evenings arrived earlier. Yet, every Sunday, at George's house, the lights always glowed warmly. The old telephone still sat on its little table, but something had changed. It was no longer the center of George's world. It had become the beginning of everyone else's. One Sunday afternoon, Rachel arrived, carrying a large box. George smiled. What's all this? Rachel placed the box on the dining table. Inside were coffee mugs, paper plates, fresh cookies, and a handwritten sign. George picked it up. It read, Sunday Circle, everyone, welcome. George looked puzzled. Rachel smiled. I've been thinking, why should only one person receive a phone call each Sunday? What if they came here? Instead, George remained silent. He had never imagined opening his home to strangers. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure anyone would come. Rachel gently touched his arm. They'll come. They're waiting for someone to invite them. That evening, Walter arrived first, holding a homemade apple pie. I figured you might need dessert, he joked. A few minutes later, Frank, the retired veteran, walked through the door. Then Helen, then Mr. Collins, then Mrs. Peterson, who had recently lost her younger sister. On and on, people entered, not carrying anything expensive, only stories, memories, and smiles. By 6 o'clock, every chair around the dining table was occupied. George quietly looked around. The room sounded different. Someone laughed. In the kitchen, someone else poured coffee. Walter argued about baseball. Frank insisted the coffee needed more sugar. Even Sophie had convinced everyone to play a simple card game. George leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. For just a moment, the laughter felt familiar. It sounded like Christmas. like Thanksgiving, like birthdays, like every happy memory he and Margaret had ever shared. Rachel noticed the tears in his eyes. "You okay?" she asked softly. George smiled. "I was just listening." "To what?" He looked around the room, to my house, being alive again. Dinner ended, but no one wanted to leave. Instead, Walter suggested, "What if we meet every Sunday?" Helen nodded. "There are too many people eating alone." Frank raised his coffee mug. "Then let's promise each other no Sundays alone anymore." Everyone lifted their mugs. "Agreed." George quietly looked toward Margaret's photograph. He whispered, so softly, only he could hear, "We did it. The house is full again." As the evening came to an end, people hugged, exchanged phone numbers, promised to bring recipes. The following week, the old telephone never rang. That evening, it didn't need to, because the people who once waited for someone to call were now sitting together around one table. George walked to the front porch. Snowflakes began to fall. On a bit on. Behind him, he could still hear laughter echoing through the house. For years, he believed a ringing telephone could chase away loneliness. Now, he understood something even greater. A single phone call can begin a friendship, but an open door can build a family. As George turned off the porch light, he smiled. He no longer counted the Sundays he had left. He simply looked forward to the next one. Vinta wrapped Maple Street in a blanket of quiet snow. Every Sunday evening, the porch light outside George's house turned on at exactly 5 o'clock. It had become a signal, not just for neighbors, but for anyone who needed a place to go. The little gathering had grown week after week. Sometimes 10 people came, sometimes 15. No invitation, no reservations, only one simple rule, written neatly on a small wooden sign beside the front door. "If you don't want to eat alone, come in." One snowy Sunday, Rachel looked around the dining room. Every chair was occupied, except one, the chair at the end of the table. George noticed her expression. He smiled. "Leave it," Rachel asked. "What if no one comes?" George answered, with complete certainty. "Someone always does." Dinner began. Warm soup, fresh bread, homemade pie. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, stories filled the room. Just as everyone finished eating, a hesitant knock echoed through the house. George slowly walked to the front door. Standing outside was an elderly man, perhaps 80 years old. His coat was covered with snow. His hands shook slightly, whether from the cold or something deeper. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I saw the light and the sign. I hope I'm not interrupting." George smiled, as though he had been expecting him. "Not at all. I think we've been saving a seat for you." The old man looked past George toward the table. Every face turned toward him, not with curiosity, with welcome. George gently pulled back the last empty chair. "Please, sit." The man slowly lowered himself into the chair. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, "My name is Thomas. My wife passed away 3 months ago. Tonight would have been our 56th wedding anniversary." The room became quiet. Helen reached across the table, placed her hand over his. "I understand," she whispered. "So do I," said Walter. "So do all of us," George added. "No one tried to fix his sadness. No one said it gets easier. They simply made room for him. As dessert was served, Thomas smiled. For the first time that evening, he laughed at one of Walter's terrible jokes. Even Sophie noticed. She quietly whispered to George. He smiled. George nodded. Sometimes that's enough. For one night, when dinner finally ended, Thomas stood near the front door. I almost drove home. I almost didn't stop. I'm glad I saw your light. George gently placed his old notebook into Thomas's hands. Thomas looked surprised. I can't take this. George smiled. I've called every name in that book. It's time for someone else to add new names. Thomas opened the notebook. The last page was blank. George handed him a pen. Write down the first person you think might be lonely. Next Sunday, Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Slowly, he wrote one name, then closed the notebook, holding it as though it were a precious gift. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, George stood by the window across the snowy street. He watched the porch lights blink on it. For years, he believed the old telephone had been his greatest treasure. Now, he realized it wasn't the telephone. It was the courage to make the first connection. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the empty chair waited quietly, not for someone who had been lost, but for someone who was still searching for a place to belong. Spring returned once more to Maple Street. The snow had melted. The gardens were blooming again. George had just celebrated his 77th birthday. He moved a little slower now. His hands shook more often. But every Sunday at 5 o'clock, the porch light still came on. And every Sunday, people arrived. Malta with his famous apple pie. Helen carrying fresh flowers. Frank complaining about the weather. Rachel with coffee. Sophie, now almost 9 years old, still bringing Mr. Buttons everywhere. The little house was no longer known as George's house. Neighbors simply called it the Sunday house. One quiet evening, after everyone had gone home, George remained sitting alone beside the old telephone. He looked at Margaret's photograph, then at Emily's picture. He smiled. I think I'm ready whenever you are. The next morning, Rachel noticed the porch light was still on. She walked across the street, knocked gently. No answer. She quietly opened the door. George sat peacefully in his favorite chair, one hand resting gently on the old telephone. A gentle smile still remained on his face. He had passed away, quietly, without fear, without pain, just as he had always hoped. The funeral was held the following Saturday. The little church was overflowing. Neighbors, old friends, former co-workers, children who had grown up listening to George's stories. People came from neighboring towns. Some drove for hours. Rachel quietly wondered how so many people had known him. Then, on they began to speak. A retired nurse said, when my husband died, George called every Sunday for 3 years. A truck driver stepped forward. I spent my first Christmas away from home. George invited me to dinner. Avido held back tears. He was the first person who remembered my birthday. After my husband died, another man smiled. I almost gave up on life. Then the phone rang. It was George. I stayed because someone remembered My name. Rachel looked at the old notebook. It had never been just a list of names. It was a map of lives George had quietly touched. The next Sunday, 5 o'clock arrived. Rachel stood in front of George's house. She held the old key. For a long moment, she hesitated. Then, she unlocked the front door. The porch light was already on. Walter arrived first. I brought pie. He smiled. Helen came next. Frank followed. Soon, the house filled again. Exactly the way George would have wanted. After dinner, everyone became quiet. Rachel walked to the little table where the old telephone still rested. Beside it lay the notebook. She slowly opened the last page. Thomas, the man who had joined only months before, had filled the blank pages with new names. There were already 23. Rachel smiled. The notebook was growing again. Just then, the old telephone rang. Everyone looked toward it. Rachel answered. Hello? A soft voice spoke. My name is Eleanor. I was given this number by my doctor. He said, if I ever felt alone, I should call. On Sunday, Rachel smiled warmly. You called the right place. There was silence. Then the elderly woman whispered, I've forgotten what it feels like to have someone to talk to. Rachel looked around the room. Every face was smiling, waiting, ready. She answered gently, You don't have to be lonely anymore. Would you like to join us next Sunday? The woman began to cry. I'd like that very much. Rachel gently closed her eyes. At that moment, she understood George's greatest lesson. A ringing telephone was never about the call. It was about letting another human being know they still mattered. Outside, the evening sun settled softly over Maple Street. Inside the Sunday house, the laughter continued. Different voices, different generations, the same kindness, the same promise. On the little table, the old telephone stood quietly, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder that one act of simple kindness can hecho for generations. Final message. You may never know who is sitting beside a silent telephone, hoping someone will remember them. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't money or flowers or grand gestures. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, a familiar voice, a simple question. How are you today? Because for someone who feels forgotten, that one phone call can sound like hope itself.